Hi, this is Elliot Eisenberg of Graphs and Laughs, hoping to give you some insight into what's going on with the economy looking forward into 2020. And the answer is the economy is doing pretty well. It really is. There's no real problems. As a matter of fact, over the last month or so, we've had a lot of really good news, and some headwinds have become tailwinds, essentially, especially with trade, Brexit, and the central bank. We'll get into it. But let's begin by looking at the first slide. And what we see here with the first slide is the GDP equation. And what we basically have here is all four components of GDP. The most important one is C, the first term in GDP. And it's going to do okay this coming year. Job growth is going to be decent, not as good as it was last year. Wage growth is going to be good, maybe not as quite as good as last year, but no real problems. The other three terms, however, are all going to be weaker. The second term is I, corporate investment, although with trade, it should improve a little bit. G is government spending. It'll be okay, but nothing spectacular. And export should improve now that the phase one deal with China's gone through and the United States, Mexico, Canada deal's gone through. So next year, GDP should be probably at the end of the day, after taking all this into consideration, a little bit lower than this year, but benignly lower. I think the point is it's fine that it's lower, nothing to really worry about. The next slide, what we're looking at is automobile sales, and they're clearly declining. There's no question they're declining. They're not declining like they were in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s when things were really bad, but they're declining a little bit. That's okay, but it's a slowing economy. That's the important thing. The next slide to look at is intermodal transit. And there what we see is this is stuff that goes into cars or trucks or trains that go onto ships, and then from ships go off onto trucks or trains and go to a final destination. And we're looking only at manufactured goods here. We're not looking at agricultural commodities, which we know are doing very poorly, or energy, like oil that's being shipped, or coal, also doing very poorly. We're looking at manufactured goods, and there you can see in 2019 the data is quite weak. So we're slowing there too by 5 or 6%. Nothing precipitous, but yet we're slowing, right? The next slide we look at shows spending on households on home renovation, alteration, repair. And it's also slowing, especially if you compare Q3 18 to Q3 19, you see a real decline of 1 percentage point. And there's been inflation of 2%, so there's been a real decline of 3 percentage points here. So we're seeing manufacturing slowing, we're seeing auto slowing, we're seeing transportation slowing. There's a good deal of slowing going on in the economy. Nothing terrible, and all understand, and my forecasts are all predicated on this going on. But it's just to show that GDP really is slowing, and next year will be a little slower than this year, right? But you put it together, C, the first term in GDP, the most important term in GDP, which is worth 68% of GDP, is growing at roughly 2.3, 2.4%. That's fine. And it's been growing that fast for quite some time now. So, it was a little higher in 2018 with tax cuts. It's a little lower at times, but it's by and large fine. If this is 2/3 of GDP, as long as it's growing at 2% or better, it's very hard to get a recession. The next term in GDP is I, corporate investment in plant and equipment. And what we see here is oil activity, natural gas, I don't show it, but natural gas activity is declining quite a lot. Maybe we're coming close to the bottom. I'm thinking we're beginning to get to the bottom of it, but number of rigs being used to explore for oil exploration and production is well down because prices are much lower, profits are much lower. The frackers haven't made any profit for Wall Street, and so on and so forth. So energy production and exploration is weakening. That hurts the economy. Manufacturing, here's the next slide, you can see it here. Manufacturing, it's below the black horizontal line at 50 on one side and 0 on the other. This says that manufacturing's in a mild recession. Nothing really extreme. Nothing like it was 20 years ago when 10 years ago when there was a massive recession, or nearly 20 years ago when there was a recession. But a mild recession like actually manufacturing had in 2015-16. And it's okay. We can survive it because manufacturing is much less important as a percent of GDP than it was in the past. It's only now 11 or 12%, not 30 or 33%. So we can withstand a mild manufacturing recession, which is what we're experiencing. So we're seeing manufacturing, that's cars, truck sales are weak, recreational vehicle sales are down, transportation is down. We saw that because of manufacturing and the ships. So that's weakening. Agriculture is doing poorly. Energy is doing poorly. Trade's doing poorly. So our economy really is slowing. But again, those headwinds are turning around and becoming tailwinds, which is helpful. That having been said, if you look at the next slide and see factory utilization rates, you can see that they're well down from where they were just a year or two ago. They were verging on 80%, and now they're closer to 77.5, 78. So firms aren't investing in plant and equipment. Now, of course, with trade coming on and the resolution of the United States, Mexico, Canada deal, USMCA, and with the China Phase 1 deal, this will probably go up a little bit, but we're still not sure how the China thing will resolve itself. Brexit's looking a little better, but we're not quite sure how that will resolve itself. And of course, there's an election. We're not sure how that's going to resolve itself, who will win and what their policies are, and which ones they'll actually be able to implement depending on the composition of Congress. So corporate investment in plant and equipment, the second term in GDPI, is probably going to remain weak the rest of the year despite the trade resolution, which is good. Right? So you put it together, this is capital goods orders in the next slide. And you can see it's declining ever so slightly. It was doing great, now it's not doing so well. It's actually detracting a little bit from GDP. Nothing profound, but it's detracting. So corporate investment in plant and equipment's not doing well, energy sales aren't doing well, agriculture's not doing well, transportation's not doing well, manufacturing, but that's okay. That's okay, because the next slide right here, if you look at the blue line, this shows you how the rest of the economy is doing. And because consumers are pretty happy, the non-manufacturing part of the economy is doing fine, thank you very much. It's growing at a reasonable rate, a historic average of what it's been since the end of the last recession in middle of 2009. So we're doing okay here. Again, not spectacular, but totally fine to get to roughly almost 2% growth. The next term in GDP is government spending, G. And what you see here is in 2020, the height of the bar is much lower than they were in 18 and 19. In 18, it was mostly being driven by tax cuts, which are in green. In 19, it was primarily driven by government spending, which is in blue, but also almost as much in tax cuts. Now the corporate tax cuts that were passed in 17 and influenced behavior in 18 and to some extent in 19 is totally gone. And government spending, just deficit spending, they'll be less profligate in 20 than they were in 19. So there'll be stimulus, no question. And with C being positive and G being positive, very hard to see getting a recession. It's very, very hard. So that's okay, but it's weaker than it was, weaker than in 18 and 19. The next slide looks at monetary policy around the globe. And what we see here right now is the percentage of countries that are easing monetary policy. And it's very high. You can see it's now at 60%. It's the highest it's been since the end of the last recession. So the global economy slows, trade's a problem, manufacturing's a problem, and so on. So all the countries are loosening monetary policy, hoping to spur their economies on. And the central bank here is also doing it, and that's helping our economy because it gives investors confidence that they know rates are going to stay low for the foreseeable future, right? Now, in terms of exports, in terms of trade, we have some problems. One, we have a trade problem. We have two, the global slowing we talked about earlier. Because there's so much loose fiscal policy, that's occurring because the globe is slowing. Because the globe is slowing, there's less trade. Because of trade problems in this slide, there's less trade going on, obviously. And this slide here shows us that the dollar's gotten very strong. And the US dollar getting strong has hurt US manufacturers and US exporters. It's helped foreign exporters and manufacturers, but it's hurt US manufacturers and exporters. So that's also hurting trade. You put it together, GDP growth last year was about 3%, the peak on the far right, the peak of the triangle, the pyramid. This year, 2.2. Next year, 1.8 or 1.9. It's a benign decline. It's understood. It's okay. It really is okay. And this slide here shows us that contemporaneously, the data's really good. There's nothing really wrong. We had a little dip a couple of months ago that looked pretty scary, but those of you who know me know I just sloughed it off as nothing to really worry about, and things have turned around. Things are okay. Slowing is not a recession. Slowing is simply slowing. Let's now turn our attention and focus on labor markets. And they are ridiculously tight. Unemployment's at 3.5%. It's the lowest rate we've seen since the Vietnam War. That's in red on the right-hand side of the graph. In blue, on the left-hand side of the graph, is first-time claims for unemployment. This is people who are laid off or are fired or involuntarily separated from their job. And you can see these numbers are also ridiculously low. We've been below 300,000 now for seemingly forever, for 244 weeks, right? This is almost 5 years. As long as you're below 300,000, you're growing jobs, clearly. And you get to the low 200s, where we've been now for a long time, you're really growing jobs. So our labor market is really strong. I mean, both these measures suggest we're at a 50-year best labor market in 50 years by first-time claims and the unemployment rate, right? This is really good. And you would think that under these conditions, wage growth would be really good. But surprisingly enough, it's not that great. If you look at the graph that's just put up now, you can see it peaked out about a year ago, roughly at about 3.4%. And now it's come down to 3. Unemployment's gotten lower. Workers are harder to find. Yet wage growth year over year is declining. It's not bad, it's at 3, but it'd be nicer to be at 3.4. That would hurt corporate profits, but it would hurt household spending. They'd have more money. There are a couple reasons why this could be the case. One is manufacturing jobs are declining because of the trade problems we've had. 2, we're not creating really good jobs. We're creating some really good jobs and some really weak jobs, but not a lot of jobs in the middle. That's another problem we're facing. The third problem is because unemployment's so low, firms are hiring anybody. When you hire people who have very low skills, you don't pay them a lot of money. And that's depressing wage growth as well. So this could be an understandable phenomenon, but it's not something that's really great to see. But hey, it's part of the story, right? But there's a silver lining. What's the single largest expense most firms have, service firms? Wages. But we just saw wage inflation's not taking off. And as a result of that, there's not much overall inflation in the economy. And that's giving the Fed some room to lower rates, which is exactly what they did 3 times in the second half of last year. The last 4 meetings, their fourth to last, third to last, and second to last meeting of the year, they lowered rates. The very last one a few weeks ago, they didn't lower rates. But they were able to lower rates despite the fact that we're late in the cycle, because inflation's not taking off, because in part for large reason, because wage inflation's not taking off. Look at the graph right here. This is the Fed's favorite measure of inflation. It's PCE, personal consumption expenditure deflator. And the blue is headline, it bounces around a little more. And the red is core, it bounces around a lot less. And the Fed wants core, red, PCE, core, to be above 2, to be at 2. It's below 2. It's trending down a little bit now, and it hasn't barely been at 2 for the last 10 years since the end of the last recession in the middle of 2009. So the Fed's thinking to itself, we don't have to hurry about raising rates because there's very little fear of inflation out there. So we should be okay. And that gives the Fed room to cut rates before. And in their last meeting, while they didn't cut interest rates, they basically came out and said they have a loosening bias. And if the economy falters just a bit, they'll lower rates. But if it starts to get hot and inflation starts to take off and wage growth starts to go up a bit and inflation starts to pick up, they're not going to be so quick to trigger an interest rate rise because they'd like to see inflation get bigger and above 2 before they start to really raise rates. So they're more likely to lower than they are to raise. It'll be easy for them to lower. It'll be take much more economic problems before booming economy before they start to raise rates. So what do I see interest rates doing? Not really much. Right now, interest rates are between 1.5 and 1 3/4. So you see I have 1.625. I suspect that next year they do really very little, if anything. The economies, we expect what to happen. We think we know what's going to happen. Of course, that doesn't always work out. We all know that, the best laid plans. But nonetheless, we expect growth of a little under 2. We hope inflation takes off a little bit. It gets a little hotter. Maybe the year after they start to lower rates a little bit. Maybe they raise them a little bit. But there's really not much going on here. Should be hopefully a relatively tranquil period now that a lot of the trade negotiations that we spoke about earlier have taken place. The USMCA deal is going to get passed soon by the Senate, already passed by the House. The phase 1 with China has gotten passed, seems to be getting passed. Hopefully we'll get a phase 2. But at best, At worst, the China deal reduces the rate of boil on the problem. We're not exacerbating the problem by imposing more tariffs on China. Instead, we're cutting some, and that's better than the alternative. So it'll help GDP a little bit, but it's hard to see interest rates really doing much. Come 2022, they probably raised them a little bit because inflation starts to take off. I suspect that in 2021, all else equal, they'll cut them if they don't see inflation taking off. Right? They really want to see inflation taking off. They want to see it get above 2%. That's really important. Now, let's turn our attention and look at housing. Housing really has a number of severe problems that it faces, right? This is no joke. A housing market should be a lot healthier than it is. Now, there's lots of refi activity going on and so on, but prices are too high. You know it better than most in the city of Seattle, right? This graph shows us total construction activity, new construction activity. Red is single fam, blue is multifam, and the total is green. And you can see the blue's doing fine. It's pretty much bouncing around for 400,000, a little bit above where it was before the recession began. So it's recovered and then a little bit, which is good, all else equal. But look at red single fam construction. We're underproducing on the single fam side profoundly. And that's the problem that we face. We're massively underbuilding new homes. As a result of that, we're underbuilding by 400,000 homes a year for say 10 years. So we're underbuilt by 4 million homes. This is why inventories are so tight. This way people can't sell their existing home because they have nowhere to move to when they sell their house. So they don't sell, and it just gums up the works. So we're vastly underbuilding. You can look at red and you can see how low it is historically, going back to this level of about 925,000. If you go back to 1970, the only time you see that level is when you're going into or out of a recession. So if I came from Mars and asked an economist, how are we doing? And they told me we're building 925,000 units, I'd say we're going into or coming out of a recession. And as a matter of fact, we're now in the 11th year of a recovery. This is really quite remarkable. This next slide shows us where the problem is. And this is what we know. We know this to be true. But nonetheless, it's insightful to get validation from the data. And what it shows is builders aren't building entry-level homes. If you look at the three cheapest bands of home prices: silver, which is below 150, black between 150 and 200,000, and blue between 200 and $300,000 units. If you look on the far left, you see they're building a lot of units. 25,000 of this and 25,000 of that and 30,000 of that. Now look to the extreme right. We're barely building anything silver or black, and not enough of blue, not nearly enough as much as before. So the other colors have largely recovered, but not those, not the cheap end. Builders cannot make any money at the cheap end. They don't build at the cheap end, and therefore we don't have any homes being built at the cheap end, and that is causing all kinds of problems in the economy, right? This problem exists because regulations are just insane. Land use regulations, water usage, the code book, all kinds of arc fault interrupters in houses, and egress and this and that, and sprinklers and fire alarms and setbacks and you name it, and all kinds of stuff, right? Coming both from Olympia and coming from Washington, but mostly Olympia and then local, right? County government has a lot of say over this matter as well. People just don't want, they don't want density, they don't want low density, they don't want high density. It's hard. Builders cannot build an affordable entry-level home. Moreover, wage growth for construction workers has gone up faster than the overall economy. And this is because the number of workers in construction today, in the middle of the 11th year of an economic recovery, is less than where it was 10 and a half years ago. This is all construction, not just res. It's commercial, industrial, non-public, public construction, roads and sewer systems and so on. So there's a tremendous shortage out there of workers. So wages are going up a little bit in construction, right? So wages are higher. Input costs are generally higher also. Not to mention the code books raising the cost of land, and the cost of and permits and zoning laws and all those sorts of things have really gone up in price, making it essentially impossible for a builder to build an entry-level home regardless of where the home is built, be it in Seattle, San Francisco, anywhere, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, doesn't make any difference. This slide looks at existing home sales. This is how a lot of you guys make a living, helping these people get their new home or get their home. And you can see here in 17, it was kind of flat. In 18, it went down a bit because interest rates went up. And in 19, it went up a bit because interest rates went down. But it's generally being pretty flat. And it's pretty flat because there's nothing to buy. Inventory remains really starved. So people are afraid to put their house on the market because they're afraid they won't find what they're looking for. They don't want to put their house on the market because they can't afford to buy a more expensive house. They couldn't afford to repurchase their own house nowadays. But luckily, maybe they bought their home 10 or 20 years ago or whatever it was, right? So this lack of new home construction leads to lack of inventories, which leads to all kinds of problems, right? And you can see it here. Inventories are simply too low. If you look at the graph, in the middle of the graph, they were much too high. If you look to the far left of the graph, they were roughly about right. 2000, I'm looking at the graph 2003, 4, that's roughly about right. Now we're much too low. There's no inventory out there. How many cities are desperately starved? And if you're starved from inventory, you're just simply not going to be able to sell units. That's the problem that we face. We could sell more units if there were more units to buy. But importantly, and this is a really important point that I want to close on and really focus in on, there really appears to be no bubble out there. This is total household debt. And what we see here in the bottom on the color yellow or goldish color or mustard color is mortgage debt. And what we see in mortgage debt is the total amount of mortgage debt today is exactly the same as it was in 2009 or 8 or 10, whenever the peak was, right? So there's no problem there. Households aren't over mortgaging. They're not over borrowing. This is okay. The total debt's certainly higher than it was 10, 12 years ago at the peak, but GDP is much higher. Mortgage total debt, if you look at all the colors, is up by 8, 9, 9%, but GDP is up by 23 or 24. So total household payments, we'll show a slide of this, are actually much lower than they were 10, 12 years ago. And the color green is autos. That's okay. You need a car to get to work, so I'm a big believer in having a car. The big problem we face is red. This has nothing to do with mortgage debt. This is to do with student loans. Student loans are making it difficult for the households under, say, 35 or 36 to get going. They have a car payment of $300 or $400 a month. They have a mortgage, they have a student loan payment of $300 or $400 a month, and that's a lot of money. So they cannot, they want to wait to get married until they pay off their loans and so on. So they don't buy a house and they rent, they don't get a car and so on and so forth. But the student loan debt's really the problem. And it's delaying a failure to launch, if you will, to quote from the title of a famous movie, right? People are going to get out, they're going to be fine, the older millennials are doing fine, but it's taking the younger millennials longer because they simply have more debt. So slowing them down, as long as you finish college, you'll be totally fine. But this shows there's no mortgage debt balloon or bubble out there. And this graph here shows us the percentage of disposable personal income being spent on financial obligations like mortgages, student loans, car payments, and stuff like that. And if you look at it, it's not at its 30 or 40 year low. This graph goes back almost 40 years, right? But it's really low because total debt to GDP has gone down, household debt to GDP has declined, and interest rates are ridiculously low. So the combination of not relevering essentially and interest rates being very low make the debt that households have quite manageable. So again, this also gives us evidence of absolutely no bubble. This third graph gives us yet more evidence of no bubble. What it looks at is the FICO score of buyers. And what you see is the green, that's the median buyer, so half of all buyers are above and half of all buyers are below. And what do you see? You see it's totally straight. Yeah, it zigs and zags. It's actually zigged up the latest quarter, but completely benign. It hasn't changed in years. This suggests that the borrower quality has not deteriorated. In red, it's the bottom quartile, so there's 75% of mortgages are above it and 25% are below it. And it's also flat as a pancake and going up a little bit the last quarter or two, but completely benign. So at the bottom quartile level, we're really not seeing any deterioration in credit quality. Yes, they have a lower FICO score. That's not surprising. They're the bottom quartile, but there's no deterioration. Even at the bottom decile, the bottom 10% in blue, there's been no deterioration in credit score. So we're seeing total debt levels to GDP quite manageable. Mortgage debt no higher now than it was 12 years ago. The percentage of disposable income being spent on financial obligations is at or near its all-time low. FICO scores for first-time buyers, are completely reasonable. Now, if you say to me, look, Elliot, really help us figure out what's the real problem out here in the mortgage market, I'd point to this slide and say the percentage of buyers with debt to income above 43% is going up. Am I concerned? Yes, but I'm not as concerned as I was 12 or 13 years ago when FICO scores were deteriorating at the same time. Now we know FICO's not deteriorating. So these are people who are just borrowing more money, but yet have good FICO. So I'm a little concerned, but not really concerned. And last but not least, this housing problem isn't going to go away. This graph shows us right here that peak millennial, the biggest cohort of millennials, is in light blue. The oldest millennials are in dark blue. But you can see the 3 bars of the younger millennials in light blue. The height of the bars is much higher than the dark blue bars. So unless we build a lot of housing in the very near future, this housing problem will persist and may get worse if builders don't build more. Now, lately, of late, it looks like they actually are picking up the pace of building and going to build some more. But nonetheless, they have to build a lot more to really make a difference, especially if demand goes up. And even if demand goes up by 50 or 100,000 a year and they build 100,000 more a year, the gap still remains at 300,000 or 400,000 a year. So I'm not so convinced we're out of the woods, but hopefully things get better, but they may well not. And this problem, the demographics, is not going to make the problem go away at best, right? Now, let's look locally at what's going on. There's an arrow above the state of Washington if you don't know exactly where you live. Data here is good. This is leading economic indicators, right? There's no problems out there. Again, I showed you way back when a graph of contemporaneous data through December 20th. It was totally fine. This data is also totally fine. There really isn't a problem out there. This is economic conditions here in the metropolitan Seattle area. I haven't broken it down to King and Snow because the data is not available at the county level. But looking at the overall metropolitan area data, there's no real problem here either. The metro is doing well, and this is despite the problems that are going on with Boeing, which are not trivial by any stretch of the imagination. But other firms are totally picking up the slack. And of course, Boeing, up until recently, was producing the 737 MAX despite not selling it. So now they're not going to produce it. We'll see how that affects the metro area. But Seattle is a very strong market. The next graph shows unemployment, and it shows it both for King and for Snow. King County in blue, and King will remain in blue for all subsequent slides, red for Snow. And what we see is if you look at the recession, the recovery now where we are, we're roughly roughly a 3% unemployment rate, right? This is very similar to what it was just before the recession began in 2007. Similarly, it's about the same level it was back in the late 1990s before the recession of 2001, where there was some terrorism involved and other things as well, right? So you're kind of getting to the low end of your unemployment level. I don't know how much lower it will go. Because it won't go much lower, probably that's going to slow growth in the metro area because you're only going to be able to grow as fast as people enter the labor force, right? This is an issue here. We're going to get to that in the next slide. This next slide here shows us labor force growth, again for King in blue and Snohomish County in red. And what we see there is growth over the last little while in the labor force has been about 2%. This is people working and wanting to work, right? 2% roughly. This next one shows us payroll growth, job growth. How much job growth is there? And here we're seeing closer to 2.5. So job growth is 2.5, but labor force growth on the prior slide, which I'm going to go back to now, is closer to 2. You can't have one being bigger than the other here in this direction forever. That's why you've run down your unemployment rate. But eventually, the 2.5% in this slide here on the non-farm payroll growth in the MSA will have to come down to this slide here, the roughly 2% you're getting here in this slide, because you can't get workers out of thin air, right? This is home prices both in King in blue and Snohomish in red, they're very similar. And up at, for the first half of the graph, from the far left to the middle, they were indistinguishably different. And then as prices went down, they went down a little faster in Snohomish than King. As I mentioned there, between 2010, 11, and 12, King outperformed Snow. Since then, both counties have been growing at about the same pace. So Snohomish is not making up the difference, but it's staying in the game. Ever since 2012, they've both moved at almost exactly the same pace. But the decline in King was less than Snow. That's the important thing to notice. And this last graph, second to last graph that I want to show you, looks at the price appreciation in the metro area by price point. So there are three different graphs, there are three different lines here: low tier, mid tier, and high tier. Cheaper houses, medium, middle-priced houses, and high-priced houses. And they all kind of went together until recently. In the last year or so, you can see the blue line, which is the most affordable homes, have really taken off like crazy, whereas the mid-priced homes, the red and the green, have just been sagging around and really not moving very much. So this dearth of affordable houses has really caused heartache, especially of late. And the last graph I want to show you is production in new home construction activity. And there's an interesting story. In the dark blue at the very top, that's King County construction activity total, right? And it's well ahead of where it was before. Great. Dark red at the bottom is Snohomish. It hasn't quite recovered, right? So we can see that as well. But these graphs are showing us that in some cases we're recovering, and in other cases we're not recovering, right? Now, as we go to the very end, immigration is important. This is in migration. Washington State is a particularly appealing place to move to. You can see it's ranked number 7. That's really quite high. So you're doing well. The whole Northwest is doing well. Oregon and Idaho are doing well, in large part because California is much too expensive, right? And the second to last and last slide here, there's two more here I want to show you. And what they show us is how fast population growth is going. The first one looks at total population growth, and Washington State's doing well. You're ranked 6th. Good. Nice. The next slide shows us percentage growth, and there you're also 6th at 1.5%. So people are moving in here. Total population growth is good. You're just not building. You're building more homes than you did before, and especially in King County, but you're still not building enough homes. Wow, I wish you were building more. Now, how to get a hold of me? This last slide shows you my cell number, website, Twitter handle, all those sorts of things. And I put out every day 70 words on the economy. No graphs, no ads, no charts, no links, no photos. You can get it by going to my website, Econ70, and signing up there, or texting the word bow tie, one word, no hyphen, no space, to the 5-digit number 22828. You'll be prompted for an email address. You'll hear from me every day for the rest of your life. In short, the economy's okay. It's going to be a little slower than it was last year, but that's really benign. It's benign. Labor market's strong, consumer sentiment is good, consumer spending is good, government spending, while lower than last year and the year before, certainly plenty good enough. I am not on recession watch. The chances of a recession in 2020 have declined over the last couple of months from, say, 35 to 25%, and I am not, repeat, not on recession watch. I hope this is helpful. I look forward to seeing you all at some future date. Thank you very much.